That night, warm coastal rain hammered against my windshield, but nothing could cool the fire burning in my chest. My name is Marlowe Kingston, a 31-year-old software engineer who had just done the impossible. I looked down at my phone, hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the notification glowing on the screen. First installment received $7,200,000. It was the opening payout on the logistics platform I'd spent 6 years building. The full contract was worth $29,800,000. I wasn't dreaming about beach houses. I was picturing my parents' faces when I told them their debts were gone. I drove through that storm ready to hand my family a miracle. But the second I stepped onto the porch, my world went still. I reached for the door handle and froze when I heard my father's voice, low and scheming, through the thin wood. If that girl finds out about the $410,000 from Mama's estate, we're finished, he said. Her share is nothing but a liability we can't afford to give up. My breath caught. Before I could process it, my mother's voice cut through the rain like a blade. Then we handle the liability before the court divides anything. We erase her name from that list tonight. I stood frozen, caught between fury and heartbreak. I'd come home with a fortune to save my family, and they were inside plotting to steal my grandmother's legacy and cut me out of my own blood for a few $100,000. If you found out your family was scheming to betray you minutes before you were about to change their lives forever, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. Because what happens next, they never saw coming. I took a breath, slid my phone deep into my coat pocket, and wiped every trace of betrayal off my face. In its place, I put on exhaustion and innocence. Then I turned the knob and stepped inside. It was time to watch the performance begin. The door swung open on a scene that shifted fast. For one heartbeat, the living room was warm and easy. The moment they saw my soaked figure, all the air seemed to leave the room. My mother, Renata, reacted first. She stood by the fireplace holding a crystal glass of dark wine, and jerked it behind her back so clumsily it nearly spilled. She hunched her shoulders and let out a wheezing little cough that sounded like a stage cue. Marlowe, she gasped, clutching her chest. You didn't say you were driving down tonight. We didn't even have money for heat this week. I stepped inside and shut the door against the storm. The house was warm. Too warm for a family claiming it couldn't afford heat. But it wasn't the temperature I noticed. It was the smell, as Renata hugged me stiffly. A rich, woody perfume washed over me. One I recognized instantly, because I'd bought a bottle for myself the week I hit my first million saved. It cost close to $300 an ounce. My mother stood there in a threadbare robe, yet she smelled like a department store counter. I wanted to surprise you, Mom, I said, keeping my face calm. I thought you might need help. My eyes swept the room the way I scan code for bugs. On the coffee table sat an open bottle of wine worth more than a week of groceries. Beside it, my sister Charlene was stuffing something under old newspapers. I caught the cover before it vanished, a luxury real estate magazine. My father, Harold, sat at the head of the table, hunched over like a man carrying the world. But his eyes were sharp, flicking between me and a thick envelope under his palm. Unless you brought a miracle, Marlowe, we're done for, he said flatly. The bank's threatening foreclosure by month's end. He slid the envelope across the table. I finally talked them into a debt restructuring plan. Saves the house, but every family member on the deed has to sign off. Just a formality. I picked up the document. He'd clipped the pages so only the signature line showed. I flipped it open. I read contracts for a living, and there was no restructuring language anywhere. Instead, irrevocable waiver. Quitclaim. Release of interest in future assets. This wasn't a loan modification. It was designed to strip me of any claim to assets sitting in probate. Before I even knew they existed, while I pretended to squint at the page, Charlene reached for a water pitcher and her sleeve slid down, catching the chandelier light on a tennis bracelet. Real diamonds. Brand new. That's beautiful, Charlene, I said. Things must be tight if you're wearing that much in diamonds. The room froze. Flea market. Harold cut in. $10. Cheer up gift. Sparkles like a lot more than $10. I said lightly. Enough about jewelry. Renata snapped. The bank closes the file tomorrow. Your father needs that signature tonight. I looked at them. Really looked. And it clicked like the final line of code compiling correctly. They hadn't just spent their own share of the estate. They'd already spent mine, too. Certain they'd secure it before I ever found out, I set the document down without picking up the pen. I can't focus, I said, letting my eyes droop. 3 hours in that rain. I think I have a migraine. Dad, I can't sign legal papers when the words are swimming. It takes 2 seconds. Harold snapped. And if I sign the wrong line because I'm dizzy? The bank voids it, I said, turning his own lie against him. Let me sleep on it. I'll sign over coffee. Bank doesn't open till 9. Right. I didn't wait for an answer. I climbed the stairs, feeling 3 sets of eyes on my back. Good. Let them worry. The moment I turned the corner, the mask fell away. I wasn't going to sleep. I was going to war. I slipped out before sunrise, pushing my car down the driveway in neutral so the engine wouldn't wake anyone. My destination wasn't the office. It was the Chatham County Probate Court. Arriving as the doors unlocked, I need the probate file for Opal Kingston. I told the clerk. She passed 3 months ago. Since the records were public, she didn't ask questions. I sat at a terminal, some small part of me still hoping I was wrong. That hope died the moment the file loaded. My grandmother had left a liquid estate of exactly $410,000, split evenly among 4 beneficiaries: Harold, Renata, Charlene, and Marlowe. I scrolled down until I found an affidavit of diligent search, the kind filed when an heir supposedly can't be located. My father's jagged signature sat at the bottom, swearing under penalty of perjury that I lived overseas and couldn't be reached, and petitioning the court to hold my share in trust under his administration. I let out a short, cold laugh in that empty room. Perjury. He'd lied under oath while I lived 3 hours away, quietly covering his streaming bills and sending my mother grocery money every month. The waiver from the night before wasn't about debt. It was a cover-up disguised as paperwork. I printed every page and drove to a private wealth office downtown. I placed a check for $7,200,000 on the desk. I want this in an irrevocable blind trust immediately, I told the banker. Locked down tight. Third-party trustee. 0 connection to the Kingston name. We can finalize that by noon. One more thing. I called my credit card company and canceled the supplementary card I'd kept active for my mother for 5 years. The one meant for emergencies that had quietly become spa days and designer bags. Reported as compromised. No replacement. The card has been deactivated. The representative confirmed. My fortune was locked behind a wall they'd never breach. And their lifeline was cut. I was merging onto the highway when my mother's name flashed on my dashboard. I answered. And before I could speak, her voice exploded through the speakers. Marlowe. What did you do? My card was just declined at the spa. In front of my friends. I gripped the wheel. A small, cold smile forming as the skyline shrank behind me. The war had begun. The front door was yanked open before I reached the porch. Something plastic struck my chest and clattered to the floor. My card. Snapped in half. You humiliated me. Renata shrieked. That card was for emergencies. Mom. A spa day isn't one. Neither was the $4,000 at the department store last month. Enough. Harold boomed, crossing the room fast, whiskey on his breath. You think because you pay a few bills you own this house, sign this now. Or I call the police for trespassing. Charlene, scrolling her phone, didn't look up. Just sign it and go. Marlowe. We all know you're jealous Trey's successful and you'll die alone with your cats. I looked at each of them, and my mind went cold and calculated. If I refused now, he'd panic, bury the money, drag probate out for years. But if I signed, if I let them believe they'd won, they'd get careless. They'd spend openly. They'd leave a trail. Fine, I whispered, letting my shoulders sag. You win. Harold shoved a pen into my hand. I switched it to my left. I am right-handed. Always have been. But he was too drunk on victory to notice. I signed with a shaky, unnatural scrawl. Nothing like my real signature. A forensic disaster waiting to happen. There, I said. It's done. He checked only that the line was filled. I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the door. Before stepping into the rain, I turned back. One more thing, I said. I hope the $410,000 you stole from Grandma Opal is worth the peace of mind you're about to lose. Harold's wineglass slipped and shattered on the floor. I walked out before he could speak. Head to the Bohemian Hotel, I told my driver. As the house faded in the mirror, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not sadness. The thrill of a hunt beginning. I texted my attorney. Priya, the bait is taken. Begin phase 2, 30 days later. I sat in my new office overlooking the Savannah River. The city reduced to quiet lights below. A file arrived from Priya. An investigator's update on the fallout. The waiver had worked exactly as planned. Harold had leased a brand new SUV against a high-interest loan, using an inheritance that hadn't even cleared probate. Renata's statements showed thousands spent at boutiques. They were treating $410,000 like $4 million. The centerpiece was the wedding. Charlene and her fiancé, Trey, had booked the city's most expensive ballroom. A $50,000 deposit. Imported flowers. A designer gown. A palace on quicksand. Trey wasn't the real estate investor, he claimed. He was house-sitting for a relative behind bars and owed nearly $150,000 to private lenders who didn't send polite reminders. He wasn't marrying my sister for love. He was marrying a fortune that didn't exist. The event company Harold hired was drowning in its own debt. Desperate for a buyer. We don't want to buy it outright, I told Priya. We want to control it. Buy the debt. The assets. Every contract. Including the wedding. You want to own her wedding. I want to own the ground they're standing on. On paper, it'll look like a routine buyout. In reality, I'll sign off on every flower and every light. Consider it done. 2 weeks later, the day arrived. I chose a sharp white tailored suit instead of a gown. The color of purity cut like a blade. A diamond necklace worth more than my father's new SUV. The exhausted girl who'd stood soaked on that porch was gone. The ballroom was a spectacle. Chandeliers. 300 guests. Imported orchids, masking a collapse no one could see coming. Charlene held up her hand so her diamond caught the light. 5 carats. Flawless. She bragged. Trey says nothing's too good for a Kingston. Harold and Renata glowed under compliments. Drunk on the illusion they'd erased me for good. I nodded to the doorman. And the doors swung open. I didn't storm in. I walked. Calm and deliberate. My white suit cutting through the sea of tuxedos. The room fell silent table by table until only my heels echoed on the marble. Harold spotted me first. His face shifting from smugness to a shade of purple. You. Hey, he said. Security. Get her out. A man in a sharp tuxedo. The hotel's general manager. Stepped between us. I wouldn't do that. Mr. Kingston. I'm the client paying for this event. Actually, the contract belongs to the event company. And as of yesterday, that company is a subsidiary of Kingston Ventures. She isn't an intruder. Sir. She's the owner. Harold froze. I walked to the stage, where Trey stood, sweating through his tuxedo. I stepped up to the microphone. Hello. Everyone. I'm Marlowe. Charlene's sister. I wasn't invited. but I felt it was important to clarify a few financial details before this marriage begins. I tapped a tablet, and the screen behind me lit up with a screenshot of my trust balance. 10 feet high. A gasp rippled through the crowd. This is what honest success looks like. My family prefers a different method. The next slide was an audio clip. I pressed play, and my mother's voice filled the ballroom, sneering about erasing a liability. My father agreeing they needed to handle it before the court divided anything. The room turned to stare at my parents. The final slide was the affidavit. My father's sworn lie about me living overseas. This is perjury. I said. A felony. He lied to a judge to erase my share of an inheritance that paid for this dress. This cake. This room. I turned to Trey. I also did some research on you. The back doors opened, revealing 3 men who clearly weren't guests. Trey went white, recognizing them instantly. You're broke, he whispered to Charlene. Backing away. You told me your sister was the failure. He bolted through the kitchen doors, knocking over a tray of glasses on his way out. A man in a gray suit approached my father and handed him a thick envelope. Harold Kingston. You've been served. Lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, and perjury regarding the estate of Opal Kingston. Charlene collapsed onto the stage floor, sobbing. Renata sat frozen, hyperventilating. Harold stood alone, holding his subpoena, watching everything he'd built on a lie evaporate. I stepped down without another word. I didn't need one. The crowd parted, and the cool night air outside tasted like the first real breath I'd taken in years. 6 months later, November wind rattled through Savannah as I stood on a construction site, breaking ground on a community technology center funded by interest from my trust. The chill I felt wasn't from the weather. It was the quiet cold of something finally closed for good. The courts hadn't been gentle. Harold was convicted of perjury and fraud. He avoided prison given his age and clean record, but lost something he valued more: his image. 2 years probation. 500 hours of community service. Permanently banned from ever acting as an executor or guardian again. I saw him once downtown weeks later, sweeping a sidewalk he used to strut down in expensive shoes. The financial collapse was total. The waiver was thrown out the moment the fraud was proven. The estate was liquidated for restitution. My original share had been $102,500. But damages and legal fees pushed what my father owed past $200,000. They had nothing left. The wedding deposit was gone. The SUV was repossessed. The house was foreclosed and auctioned off. Renata never really recovered. The friendships and invitations disappearing overnight, leaving her, according to reports, quietly polishing costume jewelry and talking about parties that no longer existed. Miss Kingston. The car's ready. My driver called, pulling me back to the present. As the press finished their photos, I saw them pass the security gate. Harold and Charlene, shivering in coats too thin for the wind. Harold looked gray and hollow. Charlene looked years older, in a stained diner uniform. No ring on her finger. They didn't make a scene. They just stood there, holding grocery bags, looking at me with something hollow behind their eyes. Harold's hand lifted slightly, his lips moving. I couldn't hear him over the wind, but I understood the word anyway. Daughter. My driver stepped forward to move them along, but I raised a hand to stop him. I paused at the open car door for one long moment, the weight of everything settling between us. Then I got in without a word. Words would have built a bridge, and I'd burned that one down months ago. As the window sealed me off from the cold outside, the last thing I saw was my father's hand falling back to his side, and my sister burying her face in her hands. Let's go, I said quietly. The car merged into a city I now owned a piece of. They had gambled their own daughter for a pile of cash they never even got to keep. And in the end, they were left with neither. That's the lesson this whole thing taught me. The hard way. Family should be something you nurture, not something you cash in. The moment you trade loyalty for money, you find out just how bankrupt you really are. In the one account that was never about dollars at all, I opened my laptop and got back to work. I had a future to build, and nothing left behind me was worth looking back for.